Hello, I'm Robin Phillips, the co-author with Joshua Pauling of this book, Are We All Cyborgs Now? Reclaiming Our Humanity from the Machine. And in this book, particularly in the last section, we give a series of best practices for digital boundaries so that you can have a healthy lifestyle in the home and with your children, particularly when it comes to preserving attention. And my journey into the whole area of best practices for digital boundaries began with an experience in November 2022 when I started doing work for a client who needed me to in a sense, babysit some early AI systems, some large language models that we were using to generate content for the company. And again, this was in 2022. So this is before widespread adoption of large language models. So it's still, I was just blown away because not having used AI before, it was, it felt like I was communicating with something that was sentient. And one day after work, just as an experiment, I asked it to create a screenplay for me for a dystopian novel, and I gave it some guidelines and then expanded it. And the characters that it created seemed really real to me. One of the reasons for this is that I could ask it to create background stories for each character, and sometimes the backgrounds explained something in the original iteration that hadn't made sense, but only made sense in light of the character's further history. And then I could create spin-off stories. I could say, hey, have this character and that character get married, and then create this story for them in the future. And because I could create infinite iterations, it was really intoxicating. And I began to feel like I wasn't just creating these characters, but discovering them. And of course, this doesn't have the same wow factor anymore because now they're working on things like immediate custom videos from user prompts and so forth. But back in November 2022, I was just blown away and I became addicted. Um, I began staying up late at night working on it. I couldn't think about anything else. My health and my work started to suffer. This was only for a period of about 3 days, and then I realized what was happening to me. But it really made me interested in this whole question of boundaries, but also neurologically, what do digital addictions do to the brain? And even if you don't have a problem with addiction, we all have a problem with our attention being hijacked by electronic devices. So here is me as a cyborg. Here's a picture that a friend created to try to capture what it must have been like for me when I was, in a sense, taken over by AI. I don't have a beard, but I am, for all intensive purposes, a cyborg. Are we all cyborgs now? Another anecdote that I want to share comes from when coalition forces were working to liberate the countryside of Afghanistan from the Taliban. A key objective for military leaders was to work alongside locals to address humanitarian needs and improve the quality of life for ordinary Afghan people. And putting this into practice in the eastern part of the country, military leaders consulted with the village council to identify areas of need. The men on the council shared that their community needed a local well. As things stood, the village women had to travel 4 miles daily to draw water from a river and bring it back to town. So, eager to help, the coalition forces installed a well and made great rejoicing. But the rejoicing was short-lived. because um, yes, the women were freed from the task of the burden of carrying water back and forth every day, but the well kept breaking down. And after being repaired each time, it would malfunction shortly afterwards. And eventually it became clear that someone was deliberately sabotaging the pump. A search was conducted, but to no avail. They couldn't find who this invisible enemy was. And finally, after extensive surveillance, the culprit was discovered. And to everyone's amazement, it was the women of the village who were sabotaging their own well. And from a Westerner's perspective, this seems bizarre. After all, the well had liberated the women from having to travel 3 or 4 miles in the heat. But from the women's perspective, the daily journey to the river was their only opportunity to interact with one another and to share news, to plan their children's um, 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 to do matchmaking. That's the word I'm looking for. Um, they would do matchmaking. They would share news. They would escape the boredom of life in their compounds. So the daily journey to the river was less of a trial than the burden of having their work taken away from them. This story illustrates two important principles. The first is that there are often unforeseen consequences to our technologies as they bring opposite results to what we initially expected. We have plenty of examples of this from our own country. For example, when electrical appliances were introduced into the home, it did not actually make life easier for housewives because expectations merely increased. Now it became a sign of sloth to wear clothes that were not ironed. Rather, and there began to be rugs that had to be vacuumed every day, and so forth. I have another video about that. But the point is that technologies come with trade-offs that are not always easy to anticipate in advance. But secondly, and related to this, the story um, the story of the Afghan women in the eastern Afghanistan countryside illustrates that sometimes technologies that make life easier for one segment of the population add a corresponding burden to another segment. No doubt the well benefited the men in the region who could deploy the save time in um, giving the women other work to do. Um, the the women gained hours every afternoon that could be used for other chores and tasks, but it did not benefit the women. Um, and both of these factors are present with the current paradox of our digital interfaces, phones, computers, tablets, and so forth. The paradox is that these devices certainly make life easier, at least in particular ways, for one segment of the population, namely adults. After all, we no longer have to worry about having to read maps, having to memorize phone numbers, having to sort through paper records. Certainly these devices make life harder for adults in other ways, but it's undeniable that in certain areas, um, these devices greatly benefit the adult population. But these same devices place a burden on another segment of the population, namely children. And this can be seen in the rising anxiety among children who are growing up using these devices. Here is Jonathan Hyatt, a social psychologist from New York University. I'm going to show you a clip from him, followed by a clip from addiction specialist Dr. Anna Limke.
There has been a gigantic increase in depression and anxiety for American teenagers, which began right around between 2011 and 2013. The number of teenage girls out of 100,000 in this country who are admitted to a hospital every year because they cut themselves or otherwise harm themselves. That number was pretty stable until around 2010, 2011, and then it begins going way up. It's up 62% for older teen girls. It's up 189% for the preteen girls. That's nearly triple. Even more horrifying, we see the same pattern with suicide. The older teen girls, 15 to 19 years old, they're up 70% compared to the first decade of the century. The preteen girls, who have very low rates to begin with, they are up 151%. And that pattern points to social media. Gen Z, the kids born after 1996 or so, those kids are the first generation in history that got on social media in middle school. How do they spend their time? They come home from school and they're on their devices. A whole generation is more anxious, more fragile, more depressed. They're much less comfortable taking risks. The rates at which they get driver's licenses have been dropping. The number who have ever gone out on a date or had any kind of romantic interaction is dropping rapidly. This is a real change in a generation. And remember, for every one of these, for every hospital admission, there's a family that is traumatized and horrified. My God, what is happening to our kids?
So I look at my phone and I see somebody tag me on a photo. What happens? I get a little burst of dopamine in the reward pathway in my brain. That's where pleasure comes from, right? Like that's where I experience like that little zing, like, ooh, cool. And it feels really good. After that's happened, I don't know, 10, 20, 50, 100 times, it's not as exciting as it was the first time. That's the brain changing in response to that pleasurable experience. Things that are pleasurable don't stay pleasurable with a lot of repetition. That's neuroadaptation. With heavy exposure or use of any highly dopaminergic drug, I need more and more to get the same effect. Over time, I experience less pleasure when I'm not using that drug. So you're in a dopamine deficit state. So what does that mean? That means you are more unhappy than your baseline. So the next time, or maybe the 20th time, or maybe it took me 100 times, people are different. I get my photo tagged. I'm like, and that comes because not as much dopamine was released, right? Now I need something more exciting, something more potent in order to get more dopamine release so that I register some kind of pleasure. And so I think this is really a key point, that we've got these sort of reward thresholds that get altered by consuming highly rewarding, highly pleasurable drugs.
There are many other writers, speakers, and researchers who have done work on how rising anxiety in our youth corresponds with increased use of digital interfaces. And why is this? Why the rise in anxiety? Well, much of how the research answers this question is not surprising. It shows that when we use social media, it's almost impossible not to get sucked into comparing ourselves to others or measuring ourselves against unrealistic standards of attractiveness. The research also suggests that digital interfaces contribute to anxiety because our electronic distractions and activities replace time that would otherwise be spent in activities that mitigate anxiety, including time spent with others, time spent in quiet contemplative activities by oneself, and so forth. Still, another reason that digital interfaces contribute to rising anxiety is that they lead to sudden spikes of dopamine, which our system responds to by downregulating dopamine production, just like we heard from Dr. Anna Lemke. And so then we end up requiring more of the stimulus just to feel normal. So these are all important aspects that need to be studied and talked about, especially in the context of families. But my interest is in an area that is less understood, and that is the impact that digital interfaces have on the attention systems, both of children and adults. And appreciating the threat to attention is key in understanding the types of boundaries that will be necessary and effective. So here is what we know about attention. Our attention can be strong or weak. When it's weak, we get distracted easily and find it hard to focus. A weak attention is one of the things that leads to anxiety and low impulse control. Why is this? It's because a person who has control over his or her attention can redeploy the mind away from the negative things in life, including toxic cognitions. A person with a well-ordered and well-trained attention can nip negative thoughts in the bud before they mature into full-fledged anxiety and chaos. And this is crucially important since a chaotic and undisciplined mind is likely to lead to a chaotic and undisciplined life. But attention is not just how we weed out what's negative. Through the gift of our attention, we preserve the things we love and care about. If there's something that you care deeply about, whether it's a hobby or a type of music or a spouse, you will need attention to protect it. Ultimately, our attention determines the type of man or woman that we eventually become. And this is because the things that you attend to become part of who you are over time. You internalize what you attend to. Here is Rick Hansen explaining about the importance of attention in forming and sculpting who you become. He says, moment by moment, the flows of thoughts and feelings, sensations and desires, and conscious and unconscious processes sculpt your nervous system like water gradually carving furrows and eventually gullies on a hillside. Your brain is continually changing its structure. The only question is it for better or worse? In particular, because of what's called experience-dependent neuroplasticity, whatever you hold in attention has a special power to change your brain. Attention is like a combination spotlight and vacuum cleaner. It illuminates what it rests upon and then sucks it into your brain and yourself. In his 2013 book, Focus, The Hidden Driver of Excellence, Daniel Goleman shared research showing that a child's ability to focus, that is, to control attention, was an even greater indication of future success than the child's IQ or the social economic sector of the child's upbringing. And this should come as no surprise, because being able to focus our attention at will and to weed out distracting stimuli that arises externally or internally is what enables us to remain in the present with whatever we're doing. And this type of mental self-control, this ability to hone our attention, is necessary for success at work, success in relationships, and success in school. This is disruptive to our educational models because it suggests that the content going into the child's brain is actually less important than the mind's ability to focus its attention. And this ability to have a focused attention is called by various names. Um, Within the Christian tradition, it's often called vigilance, mindfulness, watchfulness, mental self-control. Call it whatever you like, but it's the ability to control our attention and to focus our mind where we choose to place it without being subject to all of the distractions around us, whether those distractions arise internally in our own brain or from an external or an electronic source. And despite how important attention is, most of us don't actually understand it. We understand anxiety pretty well, but not attention, and not the crucial link between attention and anxiety. And consequently, we don't really understand about the boundaries we need for protecting our attention. And partly this is because of multiple myths and misunderstandings about how we use the brain. And we talk about 4 or 5 of these myths and misunderstandings in our book in the last section. And one of these myths is about multitasking. Now, you've probably heard people say things like, I can use my phone while engaged in other activities because I'm a great multitasker, or I'm the queen of multitasking, etc., etc. And these types of statements are based on the misconception that multitasking is like a skill, something you get better at through practice. Way back in 2009, researchers at Stanford found that those who multitask frequently and who believed that it boosted their performance were actually worse at multitasking than those who preferred not to multitask. When the researchers studied a group of frequent multitaskers compared to light multitaskers, the light multitaskers actually performed better at multitasking. The more you multitask, the worse you become at it. This is, of course, is counterintuitive because most of the time we grow more skilled at the things we practice. If you're learning a foreign language or practicing the guitar, chances are you'll get better at it the more you practice it. But with multitasking, this is flipped. You become worse at it the more you do. If you multitask a lot, and this was an interesting part of the Stanford study, if you think you're good at it, there's a statistical likelihood that you're actually a very poor multitasker. Okay, but so what? Well, there was a darker side of this study. And this study, which has been reinforced by a string of more recent research, found that multitasking makes a person more susceptible to interference from irrelevant environmental stimuli and, this is crucial, from irrelevant representations in memory. The thoughts that arise in your mind, do you have impulse control to say no to those, or do you have to follow every thought that arises in your brain? Now, why are multitaskers more susceptible to interference from irrelevant environmental stimuli and representations in the mind? Well, remember what I shared earlier, that a strong attention allows the individual to redeploy the mind away from the negative things in life and to exercise censorship over the content of one's attention. Multitasking undermines this. When we multitask, rather than inhibiting extraneous stimuli and strengthening our capacity for single-minded focus on one thing, we do the opposite through continually shifting our attention from one thing to the next. And over time, this makes it harder to exercise censorship over thoughts we'd rather not entertain. And so by multitasking, we're actually malforming our brain and weakening the attentiveness muscles that we need for censoring unwanted cognitions. Another study looked at children ages 1 to 3 playing with toys while a game show was on in the background. And you can get the reference for all these studies in our book, particularly the last section, which is about boundaries and about attention. Now, when the children were playing with the game show in the background, they began to look like junior multitaskers, moving from toy to toy, unfocused, forgetting what they were doing, and so forth. Um, they wasted a lot of time actually, and that's another myth about multitasking, which is that it saves time. It doesn't actually save time; it wastes time, um, because we are less efficient at what we're doing. And even the term multitasking is a misnomer, since the brain is not really engaged. The brain isn't actually engaging in different activities simultaneously, but switching back and forth between them. And over time, I know I mentioned this before, but I'm going to keep hitting it because this is crucial. Over time, this does more than merely destroy our attention. It erodes impulse control. Impulse control de depends on rejecting interference from irrelevant stimuli, whether arising internally from one's emotions, passions, and mental representations, or arising from an external source. The same neurological systems involved in choosing to ignore electronic distractions are the same systems involved in choosing to ignore distractions arising from the flesh, from the devil, and from memory. Thankfully, there is a solution. In fact, this might seem counterintuitive, but you can actually leverage your digital devices for strengthening your attention. And how do you do that? You do that by making your digital interface into a single channel device. Focus on what you're doing by turning everything else off and make the digital interface a single channel device. For example, if you are using social media, as I occasionally do, turn off everything else. Don't use Facebook or Twitter while you're in Microsoft Word or a Google document writing something. If you're watching TV or playing a computer game, turn off your email and text alerts. If you're listening to an audiobook on your phone, turn off notifications and everything else. In this way, you can use your device to actually strengthen rather than erode your attention. Rather, you're using your device in a way that doesn't encourage split focus and continuous partial attention. Now, I want to burrow a little deeper into why this is so important. Neuroscientists at MIT have used the term switch cost to describe the loss of attention when we're pulled away from a task, even if only for a split second, to glance at a message or an alert. And this redirection of our attention has an effect on the brain's ability to focus that lasts up to 15 or 20 seconds. The worst effects of switch cost occur in the first 64 seconds after checking one's email or text messages, regardless of whether there is a message of significance. You might not be consciously thinking about the message, but unconsciously your brain is still partially working on it. So suppose you're having a conversation with someone for an hour, but they quickly glance at the message or a notification twice in that hour. That means you might not have the person's full attention for more than 20 minutes out of that hour. They think that they're giving you their full attention, But because of switch cost, they are only giving you continuous partial attention. There is a cost in terms of attentiveness from moving your attention from one thing to the next. But it gets worse. The impact of digital distraction occurs even when there are no actual distractions, as long as there is the potential to be distracted. This is called interruption potential. Knowing that at any time your attention might be pulled away from a movie or a conversation or a book or a project you're doing on the computer stops you from being able to fully engage, regardless of whether there is an actual distraction, because there's a drain on the brain's working memory. And I'll give an example from my own life. Knowing that at any moment a bell might go off to alert me of an incoming text message or notification keeps me on the edge, always ready to be interrupted, always ready to have my focus diverted, regardless of whether an actual interruption occurs. I might go for an entire hour without an actual interruption, but I'm ready to be interrupted, ready to have my attention redirected. And much of this is unconscious. This is just what happens when we have our phone in the same room with us. And most of us carry our phones in our pockets. And so we can constantly exist in a state of interruption readiness, interruption potential. And the overall impact of being constantly prepared to be interrupted will block me from full engagement with any one activity. I begin to exist in a state of continuous partial attention. Even after turning off all notifications, I still find myself distracted when trying to read or pray or work. At the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I wonder if so and so has responded to my message. Or um, I wonder if somebody's commented on this article I've written on Substack. And for other people, the issue isn't messages or comments, but maybe the pull of news or perhaps the stimulation of social media. I wonder if something's happened that I've missed. I haven't checked the news for 6 hours. So there's this drain on our frontal cortex. And this is, I'm trying to emphasize that this occurs even if there's the potential for interruptions, regardless of whether there's any actual interruptions. And this has an effect on the brain's ability to be fully present and to be fully attentive. Now, there's some really fun strategies about how you can overcome this. Uh, there's some really good news to share with you. But before I do, I wanted to just share this quotation from a really cool recent book. Often the redirection of attention seems minor and trivial. Is there really anything so bad with quickly answering a text message during a movie or glancing at an incoming email while walking with a friend? In itself, no. But if these behaviors are repeated enough to become habitual, the aggregate impact will be to normalize the condition of continuous partial attention, thus eroding the power of our executive networks to control what we orient toward. After all, attention is like a muscle. You either use it or lose it. Thus, when continuous partial attention becomes ingrained, it starts being difficult to deeply focus on any one thing for a long period of time. And it becomes especially difficult to focus on something complex that requires higher cognitive functions. So the good news is that you can protect your attention by having all sounds and notifications turned off. And this is what I do. I even have text notifications turned off. Um, both so if somebody texts me, I will not hear it and I will not even see it on my home screen. Um, I won't know that somebody has sent me a message until it's my time to go and check. And that would be different each day, depending on my workload and depending on what I might be expecting. Often I will check my messages when I'm pivoting from one activity to the next. You make your own rules based on what works well for you. In my case, friends and family know that if there is an emergency, they can phone me because my ringer is always on, um, except not at night. Um, so, and that works well for me. There is, I have no audible notifications unless somebody phones me, and I cannot see text messages from my home screen. And so that's a very important boundary. Turn off notifications so that your attention is not diverted from the thing that you are focusing on. I had that last point down pretty well. I was limiting my digital interfaces to the afternoons. But then something happened. In the run up to finishing the book with Joshua, I was so busy and going through so much information and so many communications with the reviewers, the publishers, the editors, that I lost the good habits. And when the book was finished, I looked forward to getting back into my old routine. But I found it was very difficult. I found like that I was like um, compulsively checking for messages and so forth, even when I was even when it was not my time for checking things. And so I needed a little bit of extra. I'll show you what I did. So I got this K-safe device, and you put your phone in here. I can't demonstrate because my phone is upstairs in my bedroom right now, but you put your phone in, then you set it for how long you want it to be locked for. It can go up to days, anywhere from 1 minute to 7 days. And then once the lock engages, there's nothing you can do short of breaking the box to retrieve your device. And I don't know how you would break the box anyway. It's pretty secure. So when I found that I had some of my good habits that I had established were eroded, when I'm reading a book and I find myself, oh, I wonder if somebody sent me a message. It's like, okay, phone is going in the box. And yeah, so that's been a very valuable thing for me. But um, whether you need that extra crutch or not, have time set aside for using whatever applications are most distracting. So if you like to watch YouTube Shorts or go on Instagram, have set times where you do that. So whether it's like, okay, every evening from 6 to 7 is going to be my Instagram time or my doom scrolling time or whatever. But and focus. Use that time to strengthen your attention by focusing on that activity. But what you want to avoid is having these activities and the stimulation bleed into everything else, so that um, you're training yourself for continuous partial attention. So have set times set aside for using whatever applications you find most distracting. That leads to the next boundary. While you may not need to be as drastic as I was in getting a safe to lock up your devices, everyone will need to remove their devices, especially their phone, from activities that they love. For example, many people, when they're reading a book, they will remove their phone. Or when they listen to an audiobook, they'll download it and then put their phone on airplane mode. Um, a husband and wife might decide no phones in the bedroom or no phones in the bedroom after 9 o'clock. The point is that um, to protect the things we love, we need to have boundaries, very clear boundaries. And why? Why not just use self-control? Although it's good to strengthen self-control and to do activities that require lots of self-control, exercising self-control takes energy and siphons off resources from the front of the brain that could be used in creativity and memory. It's always better to have good habits so that you don't need self-control. So once my phone goes in the box, there's no self-control is not an issue because there's no way I can get into it. I don't have the tools to break the box. Um, so it's always good when we can create boundaries and good habits to free ourselves from having to muster up willpower. And good habits over time become internalized. This is what we see with virtue. A virtuous person is not somebody who's just, always having that willpower to do the right thing. Oh, I really want to be miserly and selfish and worry and grumpy, but I just got so much self-control and not do it. No, a virtuous person, through good habits, has uh, internalized and habituated virtue. You do that through having systems and mechanisms and routines that help you develop good habits. And one simple thing is remove your phone from the activities that you want to give your full attention to. Finally, we can delay and we can cultivate a positive vision. Now, what do I mean by these two things? Well, I'm going to hand you over to my co-author, Joshua Pauling, and my friend, Annie Crawford, who recently discussed these boundaries on the Her Faith Inspires podcast.
Agree that a key principle is delaying as much as possible. Do everything you can to give your children as long of a human, natural, incarnational, physically focused upbringing as you can. Keep the screens and the phones and the devices pushed as far back as you can so that they are living in this incarnate world close to nature, the things that God has made with their hands in the dirt and their eyes on the sky and the birds and the trees, and really being close to the things that God himself has made. The heavens declare the glory of God. He is speaking to us his presence and the meaning of who he is and our relationship with him through the things that he has made. That's something really important, I think, for Christian parents to recover an understanding of, is that God is communicating to us through his world. And so if we're going to understand him, this is the principle of, for those in apologetics, general revelation versus special revelation, right? God communicates to us in general revelation through the creation. He is day unto day pouring forth speech, night unto night giving us knowledge, as Psalm 19 says. And it's actually special revelation, God's word to us in scripture and the person of Jesus Christ, is actually, in a sense, dependent on general revelation. It's through my experience of trees and fire and skies and seas and lilies of the field and birds of the air. It's my experience of God's world that then gives those parables and those teachings and those stories in scripture meaning. And so I think we really need to recognize for our children a life in contact with creation is a very important part of their spiritual formation, so that their contact with God, the glory of God is presence that he's pouring out through the things he's made. It gives them the ability to read scripture, and it's forming their minds and their spirits and in patterns and rhythms that we were made for, if that makes sense. And then the more you can delay that move into a digital space, then the more deeply their bodies, their affections, their habits are rooted in a natural way of living, the more tolerant they will be of the downsides of a digital space. So I like to think about a tree, right? And very much our neurology is very tree shaped, right? And so if you think of you're growing a tree, if you can let that tree grow under good conditions, then that trunk and those those basic branches will be upright and straight and well formed. And then as the secondary branches form, those can grow back and reform fairly well. But if a tree is growing under wind and bizarre light conditions, right, you'll see tree trunks grow sideways, trying to reach the light, trying to deal with the wind. And then once the tree trunks are really formed, you can't grow them upright again. Right? So that's an analogy that really helps me think about my children, is that if I let them grow those deep neurological connections and habits whole when they're young, so they've got nice, upright, strong, they'll be able to deal with the secondary challenges of life later on. But if I give them an iPad when they're 4, okay, the fundamental neurological structure of their mind is going to be formed bent. And then when you're older, you have less neurological plasticity. When you're older, you have like a tree, you can kind of start to grow this way, but you can't go back and change those fundamental structures of the tree nor of the human mind. This is why childhood trauma is such a big deal, right? Because of the way the mind and the body is formed in those early years. So that tree analogy is an encouragement to parents. And you know what? There's God's grace, right? God works all things for good. Wherever you are today, do what you can for your children to give them an incarnate, embodied childhood and delay. They can catch up on screens later. We can all learn how to use, a social media app in 2 days. They don't need to practice now. That can wait till later. Do everything you can to delay engagement with that digital world.
That's good. There's a couple.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. It's we want to think about the positive formation, right? A lot of times technology, we think about, oh, don't do this, don't do that. But as Annie's saying here, it's more about the positive formation, the better alternative that we have, right, in this real embodied world. And so especially with children, we want to build a reservoir of humane embodied experience, right? That roots them deeply in what it means to be an incarnate human being, so that then they can navigate the digital spaces more effectively and efficiently. So yes, that's really important, the positive vision aspect, right? Yes, we have limits and boundaries, but also we're replacing, okay? We're not just saying no to something, we're replacing it with something better, okay? And a lot of things in your home, you can take steps in this direction. Simply thinking about spaces and where you put things, right? So instead of having the computer and the television in a very prominent place in the home, what about having books and a musical instrument and board games prominently placed, right? So that you can, the default is to go to those things, right? Not the screens. There's all sorts of just simple steps you can take. And we have quite a bit of this in the book. We have a section on boundaries. And again, both the limit side and the positive vision side, to try to flesh this out and give families ideas, right? We're not saying you must do this or you must do that, but we're throwing ideas out there that are based on research, right? That families have done and tried and saw benefits from. And suggesting them something you can do, because as Annie said, wherever you're at now, there's steps you can take in a positive direction, and we need to. We're getting schooled right now by a evolutionary psychologist, okay, an atheist, on these topics. And we have more to say than he does, right? Now, there's a lot of general revelation in here, as Annie said. There's a lot of just common sense truth and research-based truth. But we Christians can go even further. We have more to say than he does. And that's sort of what, we're trying to do in this book, is sort of going from here. This book was written, just came out when we were finishing this one up. Going from here and going a little bit further with the Christian worldview, and going beyond the home, going beyond the school, into the home, into the church, and so forth. Because a lot of Haidt's advice really relates to schools, right? And what we should do with schools. He does have I'm just going to reiterate his 4 basic pieces of advice. And again, this is from sort of an evolutionary psychologist, just from the research. He has no theological, agenda or anything like that. He says no smartphones before high school, no social media before the age of 16. He says school should be phone free, and that there should be far more unsupervised play and childhood independence, right? I think those are 4 very basic and sort of core fundamental reforms that we should be willing to think about and willing to try out.
Yeah.
And Josh,
Well, my friends, thank you so much for the gift of your attention during this video. And that's all I have to say for today, but I'm going to follow this up with future lectures offering more boundaries and research-based best practices so that you can protect your mind and the things you love. You're welcome to buy a copy of our book, which is available on Amazon. And you can also check out my personal website, robinmarkphillips.com. Thank you for your attention today. I hope you have a wonderful day and God bless you.